Our next witness is J.M. Berger. Mr. Berger is a non-resident fellow in the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World at the Brookings Institute and the author of Jihad Joe, Americans Who Go to War in the Name of Islam and ISIS, the State of Terror. Mr. Berger.
Thank you for having me. I think that I'd like to start by talking about the lone wolf threat, because that's obviously on everyone's minds after the events of this weekend. ISIS is, in many ways, appears to be the first jihadist group to really kind of crack the lone wolf formula. The idea of leaderless resistance and individual attacks goes back to the 1980s, originated in the American white supremacist movement, and people have been trying to make it work ever since. And the problem with lone wolves is that it's too easy to stay at home, generally. People are not going to get adequately motivated to carry out an attack without having social reinforcement, and that defeats the purpose of being a lone wolf, is to escape detection by not talking to anyone. ISIS has mixed up this formula, and there are a couple of reasons for this. The first thing that they've done that is different from what Al-Qaeda did is they have become a populist movement. So they have a very low threshold for entry, and they're pretty undiscriminating about who they include in their group. Relative to Al-Qaeda, it was very difficult to join Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a vanguard and elitist movement. So that affords them access to more people. Secondly, their propaganda is extremely violent, and it is also very focused on presenting the group as dynamic and action-oriented. Relative, again, when you look at a comparison to Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's propaganda in recent years especially tends more toward discourse. We're trying to convince people that we have the right idea, that reasonable people would agree with us that this is the correct thing to do. And ISIS doesn't care about that so much. They're willing to just get people agitated and cut them loose. The third element of change is that ISIS has changed the sort of fundamental underlying assumption that we see in the jihadist argument. Al-Qaeda proceeded from an assumption of weakness. Its argument was based on the proposition that Muslims are weak and that they were unable to stand up to apostate regimes in the region, as well as, and the reason that they couldn't stand up to them was because the West was behind them. So the idea behind Al-Qaeda and the idea behind using terrorism as a tactic was that this is the tool of the weak. We have to degrade popular support in the United States for apostate regimes in the Middle East, and then the United States will withdraw its support, and then we'll be able to fight these guys directly. ISIS has skipped ahead to fighting directly. Their propaganda emphasizes this. They are taking the fight to the local regimes, and they are attacking the United States in a secondary way. Their message is that we're winners, and you should join us because we're strong. All of this is part of a very complex set of problems. We're in a period of very broad social change. People have been talking about social media for a number of years, and often in very effusive terms about how it's changing the world. And this is the first manifestation of how that really is going to work. What we're seeing is that social media allows people to self-select the beliefs and information that they receive. So if you have an interest in jihadism, you can find other people who are interested in that very easily, very quickly, and you can establish relationships with them. This is very different from, say, the 1950s. If you were a radical jihadist in the 1950s living in Peoria, you might go your whole life without meeting anybody who shared your views. Today, it takes you 10 minutes to start talking to people who share your views. And that's a key part of what ISIS does in its recruitment process, is it provides a social context. It's reinforcement, it's personal validation of your beliefs. If you're going to act out as a lone wolf, they're offering you a degree of fame that you would not be able to achieve as a mass shooter, for instance. And it's very reciprocal. There's a sense of remote intimacy on social media that can be hard to appreciate if you don't use it a lot. When you talk to somebody on a social media platform and you talk to them every day, you feel like you know them. You feel like they're somebody who's in your life. And so somebody tweeting from Syria who's a member of ISIS can develop a very emotionally powerful relationship with somebody who's sitting in the United States. And that is part of the reason that we have seen people are more willing to mobilize in the name of ISIS than they were in the name of al-Qaeda. ISIS's radicalization and recruitment practices take place over a spectrum. There's no one thing that they do to try and recruit Westerners or try and recruit locally. They attack this from every channel, in every direction, using a variety of styles and using a very large number of people. Because ISIS is a large organization, it can afford to have 2,000 people who tweet 150 times every day. It can afford to have a ratio of 2 or 3 recruiters to every one potential recruit who might carry out a lone wolf attack. If there's an area in which we are trailing ISIS in this struggle, I think it's probably a question of resources. And of course the problem that we face with that is that nobody can really agree how to use those resources. Our efforts at countering violent extremism in a preventive way have a lot of problems that are inherent to them, and we also have a problem from a law enforcement perspective. If you're monitoring 60 or 100 people, it takes 500 people to do that, to monitor these people even on a partial basis, let alone 24 hours a day. So if these guys jump in a car and drive to Texas, there's not a lot you can do to interdict that. I'll save most of the rest of my thoughts for the Q&A. I did want to just talk about the prospect of an ISIS organizational terrorist attack. ISIS has money and manpower to spare. We have not seen that they have an intent to carry out a 9/11 style attack, and there's reason to think they might not be as skilled or competent in such an attempt as al-Qaeda was because of the training cycles that they use. I think we should not assume that that's something that couldn't happen, though, that they couldn't make an attempt. And I think we're much better prepared to prevent something like that today. I don't think ISIS is an existential threat, but I do think that we have to have realistic expectations about what they might do so that when something happens, we don't overreact and in fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berger. Our next witness is Mubin Sheikh. Mr. Sheikh is a former Muslim extremist and an expert on radicalization, terrorism, and countering violent extremism. He is consulted on the topic of ISIS with the U.S. State Department, U.S. National Counterterrorism Center, U.S. Special Operations Command, Central Command, NATO,